So good to be with you guys this morning. If you're new or visiting, my name is Brad. I'm one of the pastors here. Some of you, I was gone for a while, so you might have just forgotten who I was. I'm Brad. I'm one of the pastors here. But it is good to be here this morning. Right now, the ushers are going to receive the offering, so if you brought that with you, you can take that out. And as they're doing that, I'm going to dive into this new series that we're starting today called Skeptics, Heretics, and Saints. And let me just share with you that in this room, all three of those things are present right now in this room. Skeptics, heretics, and saints. In fact, let me just take it one step further and say this. All three of those things are standing in front of you on this stage right now. I have times when I am incredibly skeptical. In fact, I operate out of skepticism a lot. And there are times that I can tell you, sometimes I'm a heretic, and at the same time, I'm a saint. And I know that maybe not all of this is going to make sense in this moment. What I'm hoping for is that by the end of this series, not only will you understand how I'm able to say those things, but I also hope that you'll understand how those things might be said of you. And so today what I want to start by doing is talking about the idea of skepticism, the idea of questioning. And I want to begin with the idea of skeptics and unpack this a little bit. And I want to start this by confronting an idea that seems to be prevalent in the church and maybe not even in the church. I just think it's prevalent in people's minds everywhere. It's this idea that I think is sort of in people's heads, and it's this, and I want to confront it. It's that real Jesus followers don't have doubts. Now, let me just share this, that nobody's ever come to me and explicitly said that, like, oh, people that really love Jesus don't doubt. I've never heard anybody actually say that, but the reason I say that that exists in our thinking or in our beliefs is because of the way that people actually behave or the way they respond to the questions or doubts that they themselves have. In fact, let me just give you a couple of examples. There are some people who are exploring faith, and by the way, we always talk about the fact that here at Summit, we're all at different spectrums of faith. We're all at different places in this journey. But there are some people who are pursuing a relationship with Jesus. They're not really sure yet. They haven't said yes to him. And as they move towards Jesus, eventually they'll come to a place where they'll have certain questions. And those questions will become so significant in their minds that they begin to think, well, I can't really be a Jesus follower if I still have these unanswered questions. And so they stall out in their pursuit of Jesus. They just sort of go, well, I can't resolve these things, so I can't be a person of faith. And so I see it in that sense. I also see it within people who have already made the decision to follow Jesus. For years, I've had conversations with people who will come to me and sort of in the kind of the quiet conversation, because there's a little bit of shame and guilt, they'll come and say, I'm really struggling in my faith, and I'll say why, and then they'll say, well, I've just been questioning some things. I've been doubting some things. And it's as if there's this understanding that because I'm doubting, because I'm questioning, there must be something wrong fundamentally with my faith, with what I believe, or my ability to even believe as a human being. And so I want to address this up front, and I want to give you the real truth and set the record straight, and it's this. Real Jesus followers do have doubts. Okay? We just sit that there for just a moment. Real Jesus followers have doubts. Questions are actually a very natural part of being a human being. I don't know if any of you have spent time with a 3-year-old in the last few years. Nobody teaches them to ask questions, right? They just pop out. Once they start talking, they start asking questions, right? Nobody teaches them that. And our faith is never inviting us to check our humanity at the door. Our faith invites us to have our humanity transformed, but we still continue to be human beings. And human beings, fundamentally, we ask questions. We actually will have times of doubt. And so I say that to say that doubt is a very natural experience of being a human being. When thoughtful people approach the claims or the principles of Christianity, they're going to ask questions. It's a very natural thing for an intelligent thinking person to say, how do you really know God exists? That's not outside of the bounds. That's a fair question for thoughtful people to ask. For people to think questions like, why would God allow suffering and evil? That's a fair question to ask. Thoughtful people are going to ask questions like that. Why did Jesus have to die on the cross if God is so loving and forgiving? That's a thoughtful question. Any thinking person starts to draw those kinds of conclusions, right? Those are things we naturally think about. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? That's not something that happens every day. So you understand why someone might question that, right? That's a thoughtful question to ask, an intelligent question. And by the way, those questions aren't just reserved for people who are yet to decide to follow Jesus. Those are questions that people sometimes wrestle with in the church. And then we add some to the list, right? Like sometimes in the church, we look at somebody and we go, well, that person loves Jesus so much, and they're following God so intensely, and then something tragic happens to them, and there's that question of like, God, why would that happen to them, like of all people? Or we look at the church, this institution that God has put on the planet to do good and carry out his will, and then we see it corrupted and we see men use it for evil, and we go, God, what's up with that? Like, is your church, can we trust the church? Like, what is that even all about? There are other things that we wrestle with. How do we live alongside of our neighbors and do work with our coworkers when they don't believe the same things we believe? Like, how do we navigate this? And do we have to be judgmental? We ask these kinds of questions. And the point of all of this is just simply to say, questions are a part of being human. It is perfectly normal for us to ask questions no matter where we are on the spiritual spectrum. Like C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite authors, and he said this in the book Mere Christianity. He said, now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbable. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable. Right? So he's saying, listen, I've had this, and when I was an atheist, I doubted Christianity, but then I also believed Christianity at moments. And he's saying there's this toss-up between these two things, right? For so many of us, the opposite of faith is doubt. And if that's the case, then that means the purpose of faith would be to drive doubt out of our own lives. Like if you have real faith, then there wouldn't be any doubt in your life. And so what happens for many of us, we live in this paradigm, is that when skepticism comes in, when questions arise, it undermines our faith. We think, well, I can't be thinking these things. And so if we're seeking, we stall. If we're in relationship with Jesus, we sort of go underground with our questions. We put our questions aside and our faith gets cold. But are faith and doubt really opposites? Are they opposites? I mean, that would be like saying this. That would be like saying conviction and humility are opposites. Are conviction and humility opposites? Is it possible to hold on to your faith with conviction and live according to those convictions and simultaneously do that humbly admitting that your knowledge and your perspective might be limited? The answer is yes, by the way. You can have convinced arguments. You can know what you believe. You can live that with conviction. And at the same time, you can do that in a humble way that says, you know what, I don't know that I have a corner on truth. I don't know that I know everything. My perspective might be limited. You can have conviction and humility at the same time. And in that same way, faith and doubt can live in the same space. In fact, oftentimes I say this, that doubt and questions and skepticism is actually a sign that this like heartbeat of faith inside of you is actually beating, that it's actually moving, that your faith is actually alive, that you're wrestling with things and you're looking at life and you're asking questions. Let me give you an example of this. I can still remember, and although it's a long time ago, I still have a memory for some of these things. I remember when the first months of really beginning to be interested in the woman who would become my wife. We were going to 2 different universities, and during that time, there's always that little bit of uncertainty in a relationship. We're going to 2 different universities in the same city. And so that meant that I would not see her. Like I would see her one day, but I might not see her for a couple of other days. And when I wasn't seeing her, I knew that those scumbags at the Bible college that she was going to were seeing her, right? Might be a little bit of jealousy that rose up inside of me, but there would be this realization like, if I'm not with her, other guys can be. And so what I noticed about myself, I'm not typically a jealous person, but I remember during that season, there were moments when I would become very skeptical. I'd start to wonder, does she feel the same way about me that I feel about her? Is that something, if I express something, would she express that back? Those doubts started to rise, and the longer that we would go without seeing each other, the more I would start to kind of wonder, where are we? We'd become uncertain in the relationship. And so naturally, I just gave up. No, right? I didn't give up. I went all in. I remember at one point, I delivered breakfast one morning to her and her roommates. I was on my way to work at like 5:30 in the morning. I left breakfast on their doorstep of their apartment with a note. Another time, I got a newspaper from her hometown, and I delivered it there. I started leaning in. I started asking questions of her, like, hey, I tried to explore, get to know her, get to know how she felt about me. And what I discovered through questioning and as a result of my wondering and maybe doubts about the reciprocated love was that she actually did like me as much as I like her. I actually grew in my knowledge of who she is. I grew in my trust of her, and I grew in my understanding of how she felt about me as a result of my questions and my skepticism. And that's just a fraction. When I talk about that, that's a fraction of what we're talking about in the realm of our faith. And what you discover is that faith and doubt oftentimes they actually make beautiful dance partners. In fact, let me just take this a bit further. And for those of you that maybe you've been wounded, and maybe you yourself, your faith, you've struggled because you don't know how to deal with your questions, I want to encourage you a little bit from the word this morning. For those of you who maybe you're sitting back right now and you're a little shocked that I called myself a skeptic, a heretic, and a saint, and you're still skeptical of me right now, I want to ease this for you and also go to the word for a little bit, for just a moment, and help you understand what we're talking about here. There's this story, and it's in the book of Genesis, and it's a story that is incredibly formative for the people of God. For the Hebrew people, this story actually defines how they ended up getting one of the names that they are referred to. And it's one you're familiar with that you'll see in just a moment. But in Genesis chapter 32, the patriarch Jacob is traveling back to his homeland. And there's been some conflict between he and his family, and he's traveling back to this place, and there's some tension, and I won't get into those details, because there's this one part of the story where right before he's going to meet his brother and return home, he spends the night in the wilderness, and Jacob has a dream. Maybe you've heard of Jacob wrestling the angel. You've heard that phrase before, but there's this wrestling match that he has in this wilderness, and it's found in Genesis 32. And right towards the end of the wrestling, right towards the end of this exchange, we read this in verse 27. It says, "So he said to him, the angel, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' And he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with man, and you have prevailed.'" We have a name-changing moment being described in Genesis chapter 32. And from this point forward, all of his descendants, Jacob is no longer Jacob. From this point forward, Jacob is Israel. And all of his descendants are going to be called Israelites. Anybody ever heard Israelite before? You have, right? So they get their name, Israelite. So the Israelite people get their name from this particular moment. Now, what does this name mean? Well, the name Israel literally means wrestles with God. So the Israelites, they are the people who wrestle with God. If you were here last year, we did a series on the significance of names. God doesn't do this on accident. This is an intentional move. Literally, he's naming them the people who wrestle. As I was thinking about that this week, I was like, God, you could have named them people who walk with God, people who believe in God, people who worship God, but you chose people who wrestle with God. Why? And I truly believe this is a moment in which God pulls the curtain back and he's acknowledging that this journey that we go on of faith, this life that you and I live with God, is going to be much more like a wrestling match than we ever imagined, that we will wrestle as people with God. We will contend with him at various times in our life. In fact, not only does he show this to us here, but when you start looking at the scriptures with this lens, you begin to see it played out in all of these different examples. Let me just give you one that happened this week for me. I was doing the Lectio Divina, which is the spiritual practice we encourage here outside of Sundays. We have Lectio Divina journals at the Resource Center. And I was doing mine this week and came to one of the readings, and it was Psalm 44. And I dove into this psalm, and at first it just read like every other psalm where he just starts off saying, like, God, you're really amazing. Like, we've heard of all the things you've done. We've heard of this victory. We've heard of the way you provided. We've heard of this. And he goes on praising God. And for the first part of this, I'm reading, and he comes to this one spot where the psalmist literally says, I can't take credit for anything. Like, if there's a victory in my life, it's not because of my sword. It's not because of my strength. It's not because of my wisdom or intelligence. God, it is all on you. And then in verse 9, he radically shifts direction of the psalm, and we read this. But you have rejected us, and you've disgraced us, and you've not gone out with our armies. In fact, for the next 12 verses, he basically says, we had to turn our back on our foes. You made us like sheep going to a slaughter. You sold us for pennies on the dollar. You made us the laughing stock of the neighborhood. We are embarrassed because of you. He goes on. In fact, at one point, he even says, God, listen, there are times in our history when we deserved this, but not now. Like, we actually didn't forget you, and you've forgotten us. Like, we actually worshiped you, and we kept our eyes on you. And God, you failed us. And then you come down to verse 23, and he gets to this moment, this climax, and he says, awake. Why are you sleeping? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? For our soul is bowed to the dust, and our belly clings to the ground. Rise up. Come to our help. Redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love. Talk about wrestling with God, right? I mean, by the way, you don't read, that's the end of it. There's not a place where it says like, and then God did everything that he asked. That doesn't happen. He just goes on, and we have this person who is openly questioning God, openly even accusing God of abandoning and saying, where are you? Would you just wake up? You're asleep. Wake up. I'm not sure if you catch the irony of this, but we read Psalm 44 in a book that is allegedly given to humanity to tell us about our relationship with God, and it's from God. And so if you agree with that, and I happen to agree with that, isn't it a beautiful thing that God would allow this expression to remain in this book that he gives us? See, he's affirming our journey with him. He's saying, listen, you're going to wrestle. I want you to see there are going to be times where you are going to be like Israel. You will wrestle with God. You're going to have life circumstances. In fact, let me reiterate this. If you just set aside the philosophical and theological questions, like we all, there's always someone that wants to ask, is there a rock so big that God can't move it? Right? Don't think about that too long, by the way. Can God make a rock so big he can't move it? That'll just like spin you out for a while. But put all that stuff aside. And isn't life complicated enough, and aren't we intelligent enough that we will naturally ask questions just because of life? And haven't you noticed this? Like life is complicated enough, and you are smart enough to look at circumstances, and sometimes you get frustrated, right? Just like Psalm 44. We're going to ask questions. We're going to wrestle with God. Fast forward to the New Testament, there's this whole story of Jesus bursting on the scene for his public ministry. If you read the book of John, there's this highlighted moment where the guy, John the Baptist, who is announcing Jesus, he's a crazy prophet. Basically, he's like runs around in the wilderness, eat bugs dipped in honey, wears animal clothing in a time when he didn't have to anymore. He's like Tarzan running around in the woods. And he's proclaiming this message that like God's about to change the world through a deliverer, through this person that's going to come. And so in the lead up to this, John the Baptist, he's doing this in the wilderness, and droves of people in this entire region are going to hear him preach and hear his message and hear him saying that there's going to be a change is going to come, right? So he keeps doing this, and then there's this unbelievable day when after announcing that there's the one that's going to come and he's going to save us, Jesus walks onto the scene, and there's this epic, iconic moment in which he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And it's this amazing moment. I mean, this is like the moment everyone's been waiting for. Basically, he's saying, guys, this is the one. I've been telling you about him. I've been proclaiming this. This is the one I've been telling you about. But then notice the extravagance of this statement, that he will take away the sins, the brokenness of this world. Like, that's a pretty heavy thing to get laid on you. That's not like, hey, he's a pretty good preacher. You might want to go to his church. No, he takes away the sins of the world. Like, this is an absolute bold statement about the person of Jesus. But then something really interesting happens down the road. Down the road, John the Baptist begins to question whether or not Jesus is the one. There's this mind-blowing moment, Luke chapter 7, where John the Baptist is skeptical of whether or not he was right. And so he sends a couple of his disciples. He's in prison in this moment. He sends a couple of his disciples to Jesus. And look at this interaction. It says, when the men had come to him, when these disciples of John the Baptist came, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, 'Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?'" John the Baptist, the one that proclaimed him as the Lamb of God, is saying, "Jesus, shoot straight with us. Like, did I call it wrong? Was I wrong about you? Did I not get it right about you? Like, if that's the case, just tell us, and we'll go somewhere else. We'll go find some other Messiah. But you just need to tell us." And we, by the way, we don't know exactly why John was questioning. We don't know, was Jesus not compelling enough for him? Was Jesus not healing people fast enough? Was the kingdom not advancing in the way he thought? He didn't see the end of the story. John the Baptist didn't know where it was going to go, but certainly he had identified Jesus for who he is, and now in this moment he's going, but I just don't know, I'm unsure. Like, maybe I got it wrong. Should we look for another? Or check this out, end of Gospel of Matthew. After the resurrection of Jesus, he's been resurrected, Jesus gathers his disciples, and I want you to just see this. It says, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some what? They doubted. 11. This isn't like there was a crowd of like 50 and like 2 people doubted. Out of the 11, there's 11 disciples at this point, and some of them doubted. I kind of want to know who they are. We're only talking about 11 people. Can we not know, who were the ones that were questioning in this moment? But they doubted. And how crazy is this? That here's Jesus risen from the dead. He's appearing to them, walking with them. There's all these interactions that we read about. He gathers them in this place. And some of the apostles of the church are still like, this agnosticism thing I might hang on to for a little while longer. Like, I don't know. Like, I know you're floating and levitating above me right now, but I'm still not sure. Like, I just don't know. And here's what's even more beautiful and at the same time interesting, and in an odd way it authenticates the Bible, is that God just lets this hang here. God's not worried about his reputation. Like when some doubted, it doesn't say, and so he threw them in the lake of fire. He doesn't say that. He just moves on, right? He's not erasing it. He's okay with it. Hey, some worshiped and some doubted. Which brings me to one more example. That if you're going to talk about doubting and skepticism, you have to talk about the guy who got the worst nickname in history, and that's Doubting Thomas. Talk about a bummer, right? You ask one question, like one time, the rest of your life, right? The rest of human history, right? Just can't shake the nickname. But by the way, you know that Jesus never called him Doubting Thomas? People who think that faith and doubt can't coexist in the same space, they're the ones that call him Doubting Thomas. Jesus just called him Thomas, and I think if he had a nickname, he probably would have ended by saying, "You're believing Thomas, not doubting Thomas." But Thomas's story is fascinating. In fact, I love it because he asks the same kind of rational questions that rational people ask in our culture, the exact same kind of thing. And what I also love about his story is where it falls in the entire story of the book of John. See, the Gospel of John is different than the other Gospels. It's a little distinct. In fact, we're going to do a fall series in John. I'll talk more about that. But the Gospel of John tells a different story. In the very beginning, John reveals that he's writing this book so that we would believe. And then at the very end, he also again says, I've written these things down so that you might believe. And I just want you to hear this. Verse 30 of John chapter 20, it says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples," closing statements, "which are not written in this book, but these are written." These stories that I've written you here were written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John summarizes this, says, I've told all these stories, which, by the way, the last story he tells that comes to a completion in verse 29, right before this, is the story of believing Thomas. He saves the best for last. He's telling all these stories so that we might have faith, and then he gives us this one with this guy that's just wrestling in the same kind of way that we wrestle today. And it's so understandable why. Just to give you an idea of what happened in this situation, when Jesus appeared to the first disciples, Thomas wasn't there. So they have this profound, almost euphoric experience with Jesus, and then they go to him. We're going to read it in just a second. They go to him, and they're like, man, Thomas, Jesus is alive. He's been resurrected, and he's not on board with this for very natural reasons. Like, I don't know what you guys have been doing or where you've been hanging out, but I'm not sure I'm with you on this. Which, by the way, this kind of thing happens all the time. There are some of you that your faith journey, you've had people that have maybe led you down this road that were people who had very profound experiences with Jesus. They had some radical encounter. Jesus spoke to them, moved in their life, met them in something, and they had this like thing that they experienced, and then they shared with you, and you have always felt like, I kind of want to explore this, but I haven't had the experience that you've had. You've been in the room with Jesus. I haven't yet. Others of us, the shoe's been on the other foot. Others of us have been the one who we've had this profound experience where it's been amazing, and like we met Jesus and it made sense, and all these things kind of fell in place. And so then we have smothered other people around us and been like, you gotta know Jesus because of what I know. And so we've done this. That's exactly what's happening with Thomas in this moment. Check it out, verse 24. It says, Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. Sure you have. He said to them, unless I see his hands and the mark of the nails, and I place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I'm never going to believe. By the way, I love that he says this. I appreciate this so much because I love the honesty, and honestly, it sounds like something some of my friends have said to me in the past. Like, unless this happens, I will never. That's what he says. They've had this experience. He hasn't had the experience yet. And so we read, and as we read on in this, we actually learn something about Jesus and how he addresses our questions and our doubts and how he deals with our skepticism. I want you to see this. Verse 26 says 8 days later. By the way, for Thomas, had to be a pretty long 8 days, right? They've had this encounter, and he's just sort of living outside of the family. And it says 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, busted, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand." Notice this. So he put your finger here. Put out your hand. Place it in my side. Touch this. Feel this. Don't disbelieve, but believe. And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." This is how John wraps up the stories that he would tell us so that we would believe and have life in Jesus' name. And I love this moment for the simple beauty of what it reveals about Jesus and his desire for people. Don't disbelieve. I want you to believe. Trust me. I am who I say I am. And we see how he handles this. And when you see how he handles this, what you see is that what he does with Thomas is actually what he does over and over again. Thomas had questions. Thomas had very real questions. But notice this. Jesus didn't give Thomas answers. Jesus gave him evidence. He gave him evidence. Feel, touch. In fact, go back to that story with John the Baptist and his disciples. So they say, should we go look for another one? The next verse, verse 21, it says, in that hour. So Jesus hears their question, are you the one? And Jesus, in that hour, he healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many who were blind he bestowed sight, and he answered them. This is the answer he gives them. Go and tell John what you have seen and what you have heard. He gives them evidence, right? You want to know if I'm the one? He goes, okay. And he does his thing, and then he goes, now go tell them what you saw. He gives them evidence. He gives them evidence that the lame walk and the blind see and lepers are clean and deaf hear and the dead are raised and the poor have good news preached to them. He gives them evidence. And he just says, go and tell them what you have seen. See, Jesus doesn't give us answers. He gives us evidence. And there's a significant difference on so many levels from answers as we understand them and evidence. And I want you to hear this, that there is a difference between answers and evidence, and what Jesus offers us in our questioning, doubting, skeptical moments is evidence. Because answers, they're linear, right? Answers are very static. In fact, oftentimes we associate answers with an answer that somebody else has determined is right, and we're just trying to get it right from their perspective. It's the true or false. It's the A, B, C, or D. That's the answer. That's the way we think of answers. But evidence is given to us so that we ourselves can draw conclusions. And what Jesus gives us is evidence. And what you and I are really looking for, we're not looking for answers. We're not looking for somebody to say, hey, this is what you're supposed to believe and just say yes to this and fall in line and here's the box and stay in it. Here's what's right and you just need to do this and just accept it blindly. No, what we're looking for in our souls is evidence. We want to see it. We want to hear it. We want to examine it. We want to hold it. We want to say, okay, we've seen this, and now what does this actually mean? And that's exactly what Jesus does time and time again. He gives us evidence. What do you think after seeing this? I'll be the first to admit that I wrestle with questions all the time. My mind rarely stops. And so I'm always questioning. And I'm questioning all sorts of things. I don't typically process those kinds of things up here. This isn't the place for it. But I just want you to know that as a human being, I question stuff. But I'm convinced of a couple of things, and I carry these two things with me that help me navigate my questions and my skepticism. And so I want to close by giving you these two principles, these two ideas that you might want to write down. But first of all, I'm committed to this. I'm committed to the idea, like we read here, that Jesus will meet me in the middle of my questions. So when I begin questioning, it is not me questioning for the sake of disproving whether or not Jesus can be trusted or he's real. I start asking questions, and I'm just committed to the idea that somewhere in the middle of this, Jesus, you're going to meet me. It's what we see over and over and again in the scriptures. It's what we see in people's lives. I'm committed to saying, Jesus, I think you're still in here. I'm not questioning to say that you're not. I'm questioning because I have a real question, but I'm going to believe that on the other side of this, you're going to show me something, and that my faith and your faith is going to grow as a result of those questions being asked. And so I hold on to Jesus in the middle of it. No matter what I ask, I'm going to hold on to Jesus in this. And then secondly, I'm committed to this, and it's what I call being an equal opportunity skeptic. In other words, I am skeptical or doubting. When I'm skeptical and doubting, I'm also skeptical and doubting my skepticism and my doubts. So I'm skeptical of my own doubts. Does that make sense? Let me explain it. Here's why. And just track with me for just a second. Almost done. I have come to realize that in order for me to doubt one belief or one idea, that I have to then subsequently be holding on to another belief or idea and believe that that is more true than the other one, even for just a moment. So if I'm questioning, then I have to say, well, I'm choosing to believe something else in this moment more than this. Does that make sense so far? You with me? So to doubt one thing means that I'm operating out of a system, a paradigm, a belief that I think that I have determined is a little bit more authentic than the thing I'm questioning at the moment. And when I talk about being an equal opportunity skeptic, what I'm saying is that I sit back in that moment and I question that thing I think is more true for the moment. So if I have this understanding and I'm doubting, then I go back and I go, well, why do I believe the other thing? Why does it have more authority than this idea? Why is it more right? Like, where did that come from? Who taught me to believe those things? How did this operating system get hardwired in me that I would question that? And so I equally doubt both things, if that makes sense. And as I do that, the plausibility of Jesus increases because now I'm looking at all of it and saying, why would I believe one over the other? Who's taught me this and who's taught me that? Does that make sense? Some of you are like, you're absolutely crazy. But I understand that. Several years ago, I was having a conversation with a couple of people. And it was at the elementary school the girls were going to at the time. And a friend of mine was standing there, and he'd been on a faith journey for quite a while and had attended churches and been exploring faith, but there were lots of big questions for him. And I'm standing there with him, and another person walked up, and unrelated, we're not having that kind of conversation in the moment. She begins to talk to me about her husband's faith or lack thereof and what suggestions I would have for her. And so we're sort of talking here, and my friend who had been exploring faith and open to ideas of faith was standing there next to me. And then all of a sudden he chimes in and he just says, well, let me just share with you what made the difference in me and why I recently decided that I want to say yes to Jesus and follow him. And I was like, what? I had no idea that this had taken place. And so he looks at this other person, and I'll never forget this because it's so brilliant. He said this. He said, I may never answer all of my questions, but I realized that Jesus was asking me a question about who he is, and I need to answer that one, and we can worry about the rest of them later. Most of us in this room, regardless of where we are on the spiritual spectrum, we are going to ask questions, and I am convinced that if we listen and if we look, we will find Jesus not giving us answers, giving us evidence that we can sink our teeth into. Are you with me? I want to encourage some of you in this moment. Some of you have allowed your questions to keep you from saying yes fully to Jesus. And I just want to give you space right now, a time to mark that and say, you know what? There is a day, there is a time when I intentionally made the decision to say, I'm going to be a Jesus follower. I may not have all my questions answered, but I'm going to choose to follow. This may be that moment for you. And I want to encourage you to think about that, to consider that. Is it time for you to say yes to Jesus? Is today the day? For others of us, we need some healing because we've been told that doubting and questions mean we don't have a strong, sufficient faith. And it might be that you actually really do because of those things. And I want to encourage you that God has great hopes for you, and your faith is strong, regardless of the questions you ask. Amen? Would you guys stand with me? May you look for evidence, and may you find it in Jesus. And may you wrestle like the people of Israel with God all the days of your life. Amen? Couple quick things before you go. In 3 weeks or in 2 weeks on the 18th, we'll open up registration for the Alpha course, which every year we offer Alpha. It's a great, safe place to ask questions about faith. So if that's you or somebody you know, I just invite you to encourage them, or you yourself, I encourage you to sign up for that. That'll be open in a few weeks. And then next week, Pastor Grant and I are going to share the teaching. We're going to talk about why we're heretics. And that was a joke, by the way. Actually, kind of a joke, but kind of not. But we'll talk about that next week. This week, have an amazing week. We have baptisms next Sunday. It's going to be great. If you want to pray with somebody today, ask questions of somebody. There's a prayer team available down front. I encourage you to do that. We'll see you guys next Sunday. See you later.